The Battle of Naroch, fought between 18 March and 14 April 1916, was a major Eastern Front offensive launched by the Russian Empire during the First World War. Its origins lay in the shifting dynamics of 1915-1916 as the Entente powers coordinated strategies to relieve pressure on France during the German assault at Verdun. At the Chantilly Conference in December 1915, Russian commanders, including General Mikhail Alexeyev, committed to launching a winter offensive against the German 10th Army in the Vilnius region, specifically around Lake Naroch in present-day Belarus. The goal was to draw German reserves away from the Western Front and demonstrate Russia's continued capacity to contribute to Allied war efforts despite the significant territorial losses suffered during the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive the previous year. For the Russian High Command, the offensive served both military and political purposes. Militarily, it aimed to force the Germans to redeploy divisions from Verdun and to regain lost ground in the Vilna-Polotsk sector. Politically, it was designed to reassure France and Britain of Russia's reliability as an ally at a time when internal unrest and resource shortages were becoming more apparent in Petrograd and Moscow. Russian forces were organized into the Western Front under General Alexeyev, with the primary striking force, the Second Army, commanded by General Alexander Ragosa. This army fielded approximately 350,000 troops, supported by more than 1,000 artillery pieces, including heavy guns brought from other sectors to break entrenched German defenses. Cavalry divisions and armored trains were also mobilized to exploit any breakthroughs, though the snowbound terrain would severely limit their use. Opposing them, the German 10th Army, commanded by General Hermann von Eichhorn, maintained a defensive front of roughly 75,000–80,000 troops, reinforced by extensive fortifications and strong artillery positions. Although numerically inferior, the German forces occupied well-prepared trenches supported by over 400 field and heavy guns, protected by barbed wire belts and deep dugouts. Their positions, running through frozen marshlands and forests, were constructed to withstand prolonged bombardment, with multiple fallback lines to absorb potential Russian assaults. Intelligence estimates by German staff had identified the likelihood of a Russian offensive due to increased troop movements and ammunition stockpiles detected near the front, allowing defensive preparations to accelerate in the weeks before the attack. Public sentiment in Russia before the operation reflected cautious optimism tempered by frustration. After the catastrophic retreats of 1915, the army had been partially re-equipped and reorganized, with domestic propaganda emphasizing the rebuilding of the Russian steamroller. The government and Stavka sought to portray the upcoming offensive as both a contribution to the Allied cause and a demonstration of Russia's recovery, despite continuing shortages of shells, winter clothing, and transport capacity. Among the troops, morale was mixed. While the prospect of reclaiming lost ground boosted some units, the conditions on the Naroch front, deep snow, frozen swamps, and extreme cold, fostered widespread concern about the feasibility of a large-scale attack in such terrain. As March 1916 approached, preparations accelerated. Russian artillery units stockpiled shells, with the intention of delivering sustained barrages exceeding 300,000 rounds during the opening stages. Infantry training emphasized attacks through snow-covered ground and the cutting of German wire obstacles, though the depth of snow and the frozen marshes made rehearsals limited in effectiveness. German forces, for their part, relied on their network of trenches and machine gun nests, expecting that Russian assaults would be slowed by the terrain and thus vulnerable to concentrated defensive fire. The stage was set for one of the Eastern Front's most grueling winter battles, where both weather and logistics would shape the outcome as much as strategy and firepower. The Battle of Naroch commenced on 18th of March 1916 with the Russian Second Army initiating its assault against the fortified positions of the German 10th Army along a 40-kilometer sector near Lake Naroch. The operation began with a prolonged artillery preparation, during which Russian batteries fired approximately 350,000 shells over 2 days, targeting German trenches, wire entanglements, and command posts. Despite the volume of fire, the impact was limited. The frozen ground absorbed many of the shells, and the deep dugouts constructed by German engineers shielded infantry from the bombardment. When Russian infantry units, numbering over 100,000 in the first wave, advanced across snow-covered fields, they encountered largely intact wire obstacles and well-manned defensive lines. The initial Russian movements were hampered by the terrain and weather conditions. The snow, often waist-deep in low-lying areas, slowed advances to a crawl, while freezing temperatures complicated the transport of ammunition and supplies to the front. Many of the soldiers carried minimal rations and wore inadequate winter gear, leading to cases of frostbite even before engaging the enemy. Sappers tasked with clearing paths through the barbed wire struggled as the snow concealed obstacles and limited visibility. As a result, attacking waves frequently became disorganized, bunching together in exposed areas where German machine gun fire and artillery inflicted heavy losses. German command under General Hermann von Eichhorn responded to the Russian attack by activating pre-planned defensive measures. Artillery batteries, pre-registered on likely avenues of approach, opened concentrated barrages on Russian assembly areas and supply routes, while machine gun teams, positioned in overlapping fields of fire, cut down advancing infantry. The German defenders, despite being outnumbered more than 4-1, utilized their fortified trench systems and interior lines to rotate exhausted units and maintain a steady volume of defensive fire. German counterattacks, often by small assault groups, targeted disrupted Russian battalions, capturing prisoners and weapons in localized engagements. The Russian command structure, led by General Alexander Ragosa, sought to maintain momentum despite early setbacks. Reinforcements, including elements of the 5th Siberian Rifle Division and additional artillery, were brought forward to sustain the offensive. Russian staff officers issued orders for renewed attacks along the Smorgon and Postavy sectors, hoping to stretch the German defenses and identify weaker points. However, communication difficulties, exacerbated by damaged field telegraph lines and the challenging terrain, slowed coordination between corps and divisions, resulting in staggered rather than synchronized assaults. By 20th March, Russian forces had gained only marginal ground, capturing a handful of forward German trenches at heavy cost. Casualties in the first 3 days reached approximately 15,000 killed and wounded, while German losses, though lighter, numbered over 3,000 as defenders endured the constant artillery barrages and winter exposure. Morale within the Russian ranks began to falter as repeated frontal assaults produced minimal gains. The harsh conditions, coupled with the sight of mounting casualties, strained unit cohesion despite the efforts of officers to rally their men. For the Germans, the successful defense reinforced confidence in their fortifications and defensive doctrine, even as they prepared for continued Russian pressure. The opening phase of the Battle of Naroch thus set the tone for the weeks ahead. The Russian plan to achieve a rapid breakthrough and compel German redeployments was already faltering, undermined by weather, terrain, and the resilience of the German defensive system. Yet Stavka ordered Ragosa's Second Army to continue pressing the attack, emphasizing the need to fulfill Russia's commitment to the Allied strategy and relieve pressure on Verdun, regardless of the mounting costs on the Naroch front. The strategic planning for the continuation of the Naroch offensive after the first days of fighting highlighted the competing priorities of the Russian and German commands. For the Russians, Stavka, under General Mikhail Alexeyev, insisted that the Second Army maintain pressure despite its limited gains, emphasizing that the primary goal was to draw German reserves away from Verdun and sustain Allied cohesion. General Alexander Ragosa reorganized his forces, which had already suffered over 15,000 casualties, by bringing up fresh divisions from the 1st Siberian and 4th Army Corps and positioning additional artillery to renew assaults along the central and southern sectors of the front. The Russian strength along the Naroch line was bolstered to nearly 400,000 troops by late March, with more than 1,200 guns assembled, but logistical difficulties continued to undermine the effectiveness of these reinforcements. Roads to the front remained choked with snow and mud, while frozen marshes impeded the movement of ammunition and heavy artillery, delaying the concentration of firepower for planned barrages. Russian strategic doctrine during this stage relied on mass infantry assaults preceded by prolonged artillery bombardments, with the intention of overwhelming German forward positions through attrition rather than maneuver. However, the lack of sufficient heavy shells and the failure to accurately assess the resilience of German dugouts meant that many preparatory barrages did not neutralize defenses as intended. Russian staff officers underestimated the depth of the German defensive network, which included multiple trench lines and reinforced shelters extending as much as 8 meters underground, allowing German infantry to withstand even the heaviest shelling and re-emerge to man-firing positions once the bombardment ceased. For the German 10th Army, General Hermann von Eichhorn's objectives centered on holding ground while minimizing the commitment of additional reserves, preserving combat strength for future operations planned for the summer. Although German forces numbered fewer than 80,000, their defensive posture allowed for efficient use of manpower. Supplies and reinforcements moved along interior lines via the Vilnius rail network, and forward positions were continuously improved even under fire. Intelligence gathered from aerial reconnaissance and intercepted Russian communications indicated that Russian preparations for renewed assaults would concentrate along the Smorgon and Lake Naroch sectors, prompting Eichhorn to redistribute artillery batteries to cover these likely attack routes. Propaganda and morale management became significant elements of both commands during this period. Russian newspapers emphasized the offensive as a demonstration of solidarity with France, highlighting minor territorial gains to present the operation as a success despite mounting casualties. Within the ranks, morale was sustained through the distribution of additional rations and rotations of frontline units, though soldiers increasingly questioned the value of repeated frontal attacks that yielded little progress. German morale, by contrast, was buoyed by the resilience of their defenses and the comparatively low casualty rates, with roughly 6,000 losses recorded by late March against Russian totals exceeding 25,000. German soldiers viewed the Russian assaults as evidence of poor coordination and planning, reinforcing confidence in their defensive doctrine. Miscalculations on the Russian side persisted despite these developments. Stavka believed that continued attacks could eventually exhaust German reserves and achieve a breakthrough, failing to account for the efficiency of German logistical support and the depth of their fortifications. Weather forecasts, which predicted a thaw in early April, were not fully integrated into operational planning. As conditions worsened, thawing snow turned the battlefield into deep mud, further complicating the movement of artillery and supply trains. German command anticipated that the deteriorating conditions would amplify the disadvantages facing the Russian assault, leading Eichhorn to authorize limited counterattacks against exposed Russian units rather than commit to broader offensives. By the end of March, the strategic situation had become clear. The Russian Second Army would continue to attack despite its growing losses and the unfavorable conditions, while the German 10th Army focused on a deliberate economy of force defense, confident that the terrain, weather, and entrenched positions would continue to blunt Russian efforts. Both sides prepared for a renewed escalation in early April, with Stavka ordering one final coordinated push in the hopes of achieving a breakthrough before the thaw rendered further large-scale operations impossible. The renewed Russian assaults began on 31 March 1916, with the Second Army concentrating its efforts along the Smorgon sector and near Lake Naroch, in an attempt to break through the German 10th Army's lines before the thaw fully transformed the battlefield. Russian artillery, numbering over 1,200 guns, opened with another intensive bombardment, firing an estimated 200,000 shells over 2 days. Despite the scale of the barrages, the frozen ground continued to absorb much of the explosive force, and many of the heavier shells failed to destroy deep German dugouts or wire entanglements. When the infantry, numbering roughly 150,000 for the new offensive wave, advanced behind the barrages, they encountered largely intact obstacles and defenders emerging from fortified shelters to man machine gun nests positioned to cover open approaches. The first engagements quickly highlighted the difficulties of the terrain. As the temperatures began to rise during the day, snow and ice turned the low-lying marshes into deep mud, bogging down artillery limbers and rendering cavalry and armored trains almost useless. Russian infantry units, burdened by winter gear and ammunition, struggled to maintain formations while wading through knee-deep slush. German machine guns, deployed in echelon positions, exploited these conditions, cutting down advancing units that were unable to find cover in the exposed marshlands. The marshy terrain also prevented Russian sappers from clearing paths through barbed wire in time, leaving attacking battalions trapped under sustained defensive fire. German defensive tactics, refined over the previous year of warfare, proved highly effective in these engagements. Forward trenches were manned lightly to absorb the initial Russian advance before falling back to secondary positions, where pre-sighted artillery and reserves delivered counterblows against disorganized attackers. German artillery, numbering around 450 guns, concentrated fire on Russian assembly points and crossing routes, using both high explosive and shrapnel shells to disrupt reinforcements. Counterattacks by small German storm detachments targeted isolated Russian units, capturing prisoners and seizing weapons that could be turned against their former owners. Russian command, led by General Alexander Ragosa, sought to sustain the momentum despite the growing obstacles. Orders were issued for divisions to rotate quickly through the front to maintain pressure, while additional reinforcements, including elements from the 3rd Siberian Rifle Division, were committed to the Naroch sector. However, communication breakdowns persisted as thawing ground severed telegraph lines and bogged down runners tasked with delivering orders. Coordination between corps became fragmented, leading to piecemeal assaults rather than the synchronized offensive Stavka had envisioned. These disjointed attacks, often conducted by exhausted units without full artillery support, suffered heavy losses for minimal territorial gains. The civilian population in the surrounding areas, though sparse due to previous evacuations, experienced the renewed fighting as a continuation of the devastation that had marked the front since 1915. Villages near the combat zones were further damaged by artillery fire, while remaining residents were forced to flee deeper into the Russian rear as military operations consumed food stocks and shelter. Refugees contributed to logistical congestion on the already strained roads, delaying ammunition and supply deliveries to the Russian front lines and compounding the army's difficulties. By 4th of April, the results of the renewed engagements were evident. Russian forces had managed to capture several German forward positions and minor trench segments, but at the cost of an additional 20,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. German losses for the same period were reported at roughly 4,500, primarily from artillery barrages and localized close combat in the forward trenches. The disparity in losses, combined with the failure to achieve significant breakthroughs, eroded morale among Russian infantry, many of whom viewed the repeated attacks as futile in the face of well-prepared defenses and worsening battlefield conditions. Nonetheless, Stavka ordered preparations for yet another push, unwilling to abandon the offensive until every possibility of fulfilling its Allied commitments had been exhausted. The escalation of the Battle of Naroch reached its most intense stage between 5 and 10 April 1916, as the Russian Second Army, despite severe losses, pressed forward with a final series of coordinated assaults against the German 10th Army's entrenched positions. Stavka, under pressure to demonstrate results to France during the ongoing German offensive at Verdun, directed General Alexander Ragosa to commit his last reserves, including the 35th Army Corps, and additional artillery from quieter sectors. Russian troop strength in the sector swelled again to approximately 350,000 men, with more than 1,300 guns deployed along a 40-kilometer front, though many batteries were hampered by shortages of ammunition and the difficulty of moving heavy pieces through the thawing ground. The objective was to break the German defensive line near Postavy and Lake Naroch, seize higher ground for future operations, and force the Germans to shift reinforcements from the Western Front. The terrain continued to dictate the pace and outcome of operations. Rising temperatures turned much of the battlefield into a landscape of impassable mud and flooded marshes. Supply trains sank along narrow causeways, artillery horses collapsed from exhaustion, and infantry movements slowed to the point where scheduled assaults frequently missed their intended timing. Russian soldiers often marched for hours to cover a few kilometers, arriving at jumping-off points fatigued and soaked with weapons. Ammunition deliveries lagged, forcing Russian artillery to reduce the duration and density of their preparatory barrages, which in turn allowed German defenders to remain sheltered in dugouts until just before the infantry advances began. German forces, numbering approximately 80,000 men under General Hermann von Eichhorn, maintained their defensive doctrine, relying on a network of multiple trench lines, pre-sighted artillery, and local counterattacks. German artillery batteries with roughly 500 field and heavy guns targeted Russian supply routes and artillery positions, further reducing the effectiveness of Russian barrages. Storm detachments, often no larger than company strength, exploited gaps between Russian units, striking isolated battalions and forcing retreats. German units rotated through the front line regularly, ensuring that no single formation bore the brunt of the fighting for too long, while Russian divisions often remained in exposed positions for extended periods without relief. Casualties on both sides mounted during this phase. Between 5 and 10 April, Russian forces suffered an additional 30,000 killed, wounded, or missing, bringing total losses for the operation to nearly 65,000. German losses, though significant given their smaller numbers, reached approximately 8,000, largely due to sustained artillery bombardment and trench raids by Russian forces. Despite the heavy fire, German defensive integrity remained intact, and their withdrawal to secondary positions was always controlled, preventing Russian units from exploiting temporary gains. Morale within the Russian army deteriorated sharply as the attacks failed to achieve decisive results. Reports from regimental officers describe rising desertion rates and reluctance among infantry to advance across open, mud-soaked ground under machine gun and artillery fire. Commanders attempted to restore discipline through the rotation of units, the promise of rest periods, and the redistribution of additional rations and vodka, but these measures did little to counteract the growing sense of futility. Conversely, German morale improved as the defensive successes mounted. Soldiers noted the inability of Russian attacks to penetrate deeply and viewed the battle as further proof of the superiority of their defensive tactics and engineering. Internationally, the lack of significant Russian gains began to raise concerns among the Allies. While the offensive had succeeded in tying down German divisions that might otherwise have reinforced Verdun, French observers attached to Stavka reported skepticism about the operational planning and the wisdom of continuing large-scale attacks in such conditions. Despite these concerns, Stavka ordered one final offensive effort, aimed at exploiting localized weaknesses detected by reconnaissance near the Smorgon sector, before considering the suspension of the operation. The stage was set for the last major assaults of the Battle of Naroch, as both armies braced for yet another round of fighting in the worsening spring thaw. The Battle of Naroch entered its peak from 11 to 14 April 1916 as the Russian Second Army carried out its final and largest coordinated efforts to breach the German 10th Army's defenses before the deteriorating weather forced a halt to operations. Stavka ordered General Alexander Ragosa to commit all remaining operational reserves, including the 3rd Siberian Corps and remnants of the 1st Turkestan Corps, bringing the total Russian strength to approximately 370,000 men along the contested front. Over 1,400 artillery pieces, including a concentration of heavy guns shifted from the northern and southwestern fronts, were prepared to support the assault. Despite this buildup, logistical obstacles persisted. Only about half of the heavy batteries were adequately supplied with shells due to the impassable roads, and many lighter field guns sank into the mud, requiring makeshift platforms just to fire. The Russian plan aimed to launch simultaneous attacks along the Smorgon and Postavy sectors, with mass infantry waves advancing behind rolling barrages to overwhelm German front line and reserve trenches. However, the worsening thaw rendered the coordination of these attacks nearly impossible. Infantry moved slowly through waterlogged fields and marshes, with many units unable to keep pace with the scheduled artillery curtain, leaving them exposed to German counterfire. The planned exploitation by cavalry and armored trains was entirely abandoned as the terrain made their deployment unfeasible. Communication failures further undermined the offensive. Field telegraphs were repeatedly severed by shell fire, while runners and mounted messengers were delayed or lost in the flooded landscape. The German 10th Army, with around 85,000 troops now in sector due to the arrival of limited reinforcements, continued to rely on its defensive depth rather than counteroffensive maneuvers. German artillery, totaling roughly 500 field and heavy guns, targeted Russian assembly areas and gun positions with precision, while machine gun nests along elevated terrain created overlapping fields of fire across the approaches. When Russian units succeeded in capturing isolated forward trenches, German forces quickly counterattacked from prepared secondary lines, using small storm groups supported by mortar and artillery fire to retake lost ground before Russian troops could consolidate. Civilian presence in the operational zone had largely vanished by this point, as repeated evacuations since 1915 and the destruction of villages left the area depopulated. However, the few remaining residents were subject to requisition of supplies and labor by both armies. Many became porters for military cargo when horses or vehicles failed to traverse the muddy roads, exacerbating civilian hardships and spreading typhus outbreaks among displaced populations who followed retreating Russian forces away from the front. The scale of the fighting during these final days was immense but yielded little strategic change. Russian forces launched repeated frontal assaults on 12 and 13 April, supported by over 100,000 shells fired in concentrated barrages, but the German lines held. In some sectors, Russian units advanced only a few hundred meters before being repelled by counterattacks. On 14 April, Stavka, acknowledging the impossibility of sustaining the offensive under the weather conditions and with the army's growing exhaustion, ordered a suspension of large-scale operations. By this point, Russian casualties across the entire Naroch offensive had reached approximately 78,000 killed, wounded, or missing. German losses totaled around 10,000, including killed, wounded, and captured, a fraction of the Russian figures despite the heavy artillery fire endured throughout the campaign. For the Russian army, the culmination of the Battle of Naroch represented not only a tactical failure but also a severe test of morale and logistical capacity. While the operation had tied down German forces that might have otherwise reinforced the Western Front, it failed to achieve any decisive territorial gains or breakthroughs. Soldiers and officers alike expressed frustration with Stavka's insistence on continuing attacks despite worsening conditions and rising casualties. On the German side, the successful defense bolstered confidence in their eastern positions and validated their emphasis on fortifications and defensive doctrine, setting the tone for future operations on the Eastern Front. In the aftermath of the suspended assaults at Naroch, Russian forces transitioned from direct offensive operations to a phase of regrouping and limited defensive activity, while the German 10th Army focused on consolidating its positions and countering any residual threats. From mid-April onward, the Russian Second Army reduced its activity to small probing attacks, artillery harassment, and trench raids designed to test German lines and distract from its own withdrawal of heavy guns and exhausted divisions. The remaining combat-ready units, many reduced to half their original strength, were rotated to secondary sectors or rear areas for rest and reorganization. Russian artillery, despite having expended over 700,000 shells throughout the month-long campaign, maintained intermittent bombardments, though shell shortages became critical, with some batteries rationed to as few as 10 rounds per day by late April. To preserve what remained of its operational capacity, Stavka began shifting several formations from the Naroch front to reinforce the southwestern front, where planning was underway for the Brusilov offensive scheduled for June. This redeployment underscored the strategic pivot from attritional assaults in unfavorable conditions to more methodically planned operations in regions offering better opportunities for maneuver. The Naroch front itself stabilized along its pre-offensive lines, with Russian gains amounting to no more than a few kilometers in depth, mostly consisting of ruined forward trenches that held little strategic value. German forces under General Hermann von Eichhorn capitalized on the operational lull by improving their defensive systems even further. Additional trench lines were constructed behind the main positions, new dugouts were excavated to withstand heavy artillery, and artillery batteries were repositioned to cover likely Russian attack routes. While the German command refrained from major counteroffensives, preferring to maintain their defensive posture, they conducted regular trench raids and small-scale counterattacks to keep Russian units unsettled. These operations, often carried out by storm detachments of platoon or company size, inflicted steady casualties and captured prisoners and equipment without significant risk of overextension. The psychological state of both armies reflected the battle's toll. Among Russian troops, morale had eroded significantly. Reports from divisional commanders noted frequent cases of desertion, refusal to advance during localized attacks, and widespread illness due to exposure, malnutrition, and typhus outbreaks in the rear areas. Commanders attempted to mitigate the decline by promising rest periods, distributing additional rations and vodka, and awarding field honors to units that had held ground during the heaviest fighting, but these measures achieved only limited results. Conversely, German morale, buoyed by their defensive success, remained comparatively stable, though extended time in waterlogged trenches and exposure to constant artillery fire caused growing rates of trench foot and illness. Resource management on both sides became critical during this period. The Russians, facing dwindling ammunition and logistical bottlenecks caused by the spring thaw, prioritized the evacuation of artillery and supplies, To avoid the risk of sudden German counterblows, engineers worked to salvage and repair hundreds of abandoned wagons and artillery pieces that had become mired in mud during the offensive. The Germans, benefiting from shorter and more reliable supply routes via the Vilnius rail network, stockpiled ammunition and food supplies in forward depots, ensuring their forces remained well supported despite the continuous Russian harassment fire. For local civilians, the stabilizing front brought only partial relief. Many villages near the front remained abandoned or destroyed, while others endured requisition of labor and supplies by both armies. The spread of disease and the destruction of farmland deepened the humanitarian crisis, with refugee flows continuing toward Minsk and Vilnius as displaced populations sought shelter beyond the immediate combat zone. Relief efforts by Russian authorities were limited due to strained transport and medical services, leaving much of the civilian population dependent on improvised shelters and local aid. By the end of April 1916, the Battle of Naroch had effectively transitioned into a static front once again, with the large-scale ambitions of March and early April reduced to routine positional warfare. Both armies began to redirect their attention to upcoming operations elsewhere, leaving the Naroch sector as a secondary front marked by the scars of a failed offensive and the logistical and human burdens it had imposed. The turning point of the Naroch campaign emerged not through a decisive battle but through a gradual recognition by both commands that continued large-scale operations in the sector were unsustainable. By late April 1916, Russian High Command under General Mikhail Alexeyev formally ended any plans for renewed offensives on the Naroch front. The Second Army, still fielding roughly 300,000 men but with many units depleted and suffering from illness, frostbite, and exhaustion, shifted entirely to defensive operations. Forward trenches were repaired and deepened, artillery was withdrawn to conserve ammunition, and overstretched divisions were rotated out to quieter sectors. Stavka began preparing to reallocate substantial forces, both manpower and artillery, to the southwestern front, where the Brusilov offensive was being organized as a more promising operation that could exploit better weather, terrain, and planning. For the German 10th Army, the operational focus likewise transitioned from active defense against major assaults to fortification and containment. General Hermann von Eichhorn reduced his frontline troop strength by withdrawing select reserve divisions to rest areas behind Vilnius, maintaining a core of around 70,000 troops in entrenched positions along Lake Naroch and Smorgon. German engineers expanded and reinforced the trench systems, adding concrete bunkers and increasing the density of barbed wire entanglements in anticipation of future Russian attacks. Artillery units, still numbering approximately 450 guns, focused on counter-battery fire and harassing Russian logistics rather than preparing for offensive action, as the German High Command prioritized conserving strength for summer campaigns in other theaters. The conditions of the battlefield itself solidified the decision to halt major operations. The spring thaw had transformed large sections of the front into expanses of deep mud, with many positions submerged or inaccessible. Russian logistical routes, already strained during the offensive, deteriorated further, with hundreds of wagons and artillery pieces abandoned in impassable terrain. Engineers worked to salvage what could be recovered, but vast quantities of shells, equipment, and draft animals were lost to the elements. The Germans, operating on shorter and better-maintained supply lines, fared somewhat better, but still faced challenges moving heavy artillery and supplies through flooded areas, which limited the feasibility of counteroffensives despite their defensive success. For the soldiers on both sides, this shift marked a reprieve from the relentless assaults of March and early April, but the toll of the campaign was evident. Russian casualty figures by this stage approached 78,000, including killed, wounded, and missing, while German losses stood at approximately 10,000. The disparity deepened frustration among Russian infantry, many of whom viewed the entire operation as an exercise in futility. Desertion and illness rates remained elevated, with typhus and trench fever spreading through the overcrowded rear areas. German troops, while buoyed by their defensive achievements, contended with their own hardships. Extended time in flooded trenches led to widespread cases of trench foot and respiratory illnesses, requiring constant rotation of units to maintain combat readiness. The civilian impact of the campaign's turning point was equally significant. Entire villages within the combat zone remained abandoned or razed, and displaced populations continued to move westward toward Minsk and Vilnius, or deeper into the Russian rear. Agricultural production in the region collapsed, as fields were churned into mud by artillery and troop movements, compounding food shortages for both armies and the local population. Relief measures such as limited distribution of supplies by Russian military authorities were hampered by damaged transport networks and competing demands from other fronts. By early May, the Naroch sector had stabilized into a static front once more, with neither side willing to commit to further major actions. The Russians redirected their operational focus toward the south, where the Brusilov offensive was planned to commence in June, while the Germans prioritized reinforcing their defenses and preparing for summer operations in the Baltic region and Galicia. The Battle of Naroch, initially conceived as a demonstration of Russian strength and Allied solidarity, had transitioned into a costly stalemate, marking a decisive shift in both sides' strategic calculus as they prepared for the next phase of the Eastern Front conflict. By mid-May 1916, the Naroch sector had settled into a state of operational stagnation, with both the Russian and German commands prioritizing preparation for campaigns in other theaters, rather than further engagement along the devastated front. The Russian Second Army, which had begun the offensive with roughly 350,000 troops, now fielded closer to 280,000, as depleted formations were withdrawn for reconstitution or reassignment. Many of these units were redeployed southward to bolster the southwestern front, in anticipation of the Brusilov offensive scheduled for early June. The forces that remained in the Naroch region focused on fortifying their positions, constructing deeper trenches and dugouts, and salvaging equipment from the battlefield, including hundreds of abandoned artillery pieces and wagons left during the thaw. Russian engineers concentrated on improving roads and rail connections to prevent the logistical breakdowns that had contributed to the offensive's failure. German command under General Hermann von Eichhorn mirrored this shift by reducing active troop strength in the sector. The 10th Army maintained around 65,000 troops along the line, with much of the heavy artillery and several reserve divisions reassigned to support operations planned in the Baltic region and Galicia. The remaining German forces continued to strengthen defensive networks, completing additional trench lines, concrete bunkers, and expanded barbed wire belts to prepare for any renewed Russian activity. German artillery units, though reduced to about 350 operational guns in the sector, focused on counter-battery fire and harassment of Russian supply routes, rather than preparing for offensive actions. The landscape left by the Battle of Naroch reflected the scale of the attrition. The marshes and forests along Lake Naroch and Smorgon were littered with wrecked equipment, frozen and decomposing bodies, and miles of destroyed infrastructure. With the onset of warmer weather, these conditions created severe sanitary hazards, fueling outbreaks of disease among both armies. Typhus, trench fever, and respiratory illnesses spread rapidly, particularly among Russian troops in overcrowded rear camps. Mortality rates from disease began to rival or even surpass those from direct combat in certain divisions, further eroding Russian operational capacity. For civilians, the aftermath of the offensive deepened an already severe humanitarian crisis. Refugee populations from the combat zones, numbering in the tens of thousands, overwhelmed local authorities in Minsk, Vilnius, and rear Russian towns. Food shortages became acute as farmland lay fallow or was rendered unusable by the destruction of the offensive, forcing Russian military and civil administrators to divert supplies from other regions to sustain both displaced populations and the remaining garrisons. German requisition policies in occupied territories compounded civilian suffering, as livestock and grain were seized to feed the army, leaving local communities dependent on limited relief networks. Morale on both sides reflected the weariness of the campaign. Russian soldiers, despite the respite from major assaults, expressed growing disillusionment with Stavka's strategic leadership, as the offensive had produced nearly 80,000 casualties for gains of only a few kilometers and no decisive strategic results. Desertion and self-inflicted wounds continued to rise in the Russian ranks, while officers struggled to maintain cohesion through disciplinary measures, improved rations, and promises of rest before the next major operation. German morale, while generally higher, was not immune to the strain. Prolonged service in waterlogged trenches and exposure to Russian artillery fire without the prospect of a decisive victory contributed to fatigue and illness, necessitating frequent rotation of frontline units. By late May, the sector had effectively transitioned into a holding front, with daily activity limited to artillery duels, reconnaissance patrols, and small-scale raids. Both armies concentrated their strategic attention elsewhere. The Russians massed forces and supplies for the Brusilov offensive, while the Germans shifted their operational focus to countering Allied moves in Galicia and the Western Front. The Battle of Naroch, conceived as a demonstration of Russia's commitment to its allies and a blow to German positions, had concluded as a costly stalemate, leaving a devastated landscape and two exhausted armies holding lines that had changed little since the offensive began. The conclusion of the Battle of Naroch left both the Russian and German commands reassessing their strategies and the broader trajectory of the Eastern Front in 1916. Officially ending in mid-May, the operation resulted in a return to the static positions that had existed before the offensive, with Russian forces having advanced no more than 3 to 5 kilometers at any point along the 40-kilometer front. For the Russian Empire, the battle's immediate outcome was a heavy human and material toll. Approximately 78,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing, alongside the loss of vast quantities of ammunition, equipment, and draft animals abandoned during the spring thaw. German losses, while far lower, reached an estimated 10,000 personnel, with hundreds of casualties from artillery fire, trench raids, and illnesses spread in the flooded front lines. The disparity in losses underscored the failure of Stavka's plan to achieve a breakthrough despite the concentration of more than 350,000 troops and over 1,200 guns in the sector. Politically and strategically, the offensive's impact was mixed. While the Russian army had fulfilled its commitment to the Entente by forcing Germany to keep significant reserves tied down in the Vilnius region, thereby preventing their redeployment to Verdun, the operation eroded Russian morale and revealed ongoing structural weaknesses. Logistical deficiencies, including the inability to supply heavy artillery with adequate shells and maintain roads in thawing conditions, had crippled the offensive's effectiveness. The failure to coordinate artillery and infantry operations, combined with the repeated reliance on frontal assaults against fortified positions, deepened frustrations among Russian officers and rank-and-file soldiers alike. Reports from corps and division commanders highlighted widespread dissatisfaction with Stavka's insistence on prolonging attacks despite the lack of progress in mounting casualties, foreshadowing the morale issues that would plague the Russian army in 1917. For the German 10th Army, commanded by General Hermann von Eichhorn, the defense at Naroch was seen as a validation of their fortified defensive doctrine. Despite being heavily outnumbered, fielding no more than 85,000 troops at peak strength, The Germans successfully held their lines through the use of deep trench networks, overlapping machine gun fields, pre-sighted artillery fire, and disciplined counterattacks. The experience reinforced German confidence in economy of force measures on the Eastern Front, allowing the Oberste Heeresleitung, OHL, to transfer divisions southward and westward for summer operations while maintaining stability in the Vilnius region. The relatively low casualty figures and the preservation of their defensive positions strengthened German operational flexibility for upcoming campaigns in the Baltic and Galicia. Civilians continued to bear significant consequences from the battle even after major combat had ended. Refugee populations displaced by the offensive, numbering over 100,000, placed immense strain on Russian civil authorities in Minsk, Vilnius, and beyond. The destruction of farmland, transportation networks, and entire villages rendered many areas uninhabitable, exacerbating food shortages already affecting both the army and civilian populations. Relief efforts, including limited Red Cross aid and local administrative support, were insufficient to address the scale of the crisis, leading to rising mortality rates from hunger and disease among displaced persons through the summer of 1916. In the longer term, the Battle of Naroch influenced both the strategic and psychological landscapes of the Eastern Front. For Russia, it marked another example of the Army's inability to translate numerical strength into operational success, highlighting deficiencies in logistics, coordination, and leadership that would persist until the Army's collapse during the 1917 revolutions. The high casualty rates and perceived futility of the offensive contributed to growing disillusionment among soldiers and civilians, eroding support for the Tsarist regime. Conversely, for Germany, Naroch underscored the effectiveness of defensive warfare in tying down a superior enemy at relatively low cost, informing their continued reliance on fortified positions and counterattack tactics on the Eastern Front. In historiography, the Battle of Naroch is remembered as the largest Russian offensive of the winter and early spring of 1916, undertaken primarily for Allied coordination rather than decisive territorial aims. While it achieved its political purpose of diverting German attention from Verdun, its military outcome was one of attrition and stagnation, leaving the front lines largely unchanged. The operation exemplifies the challenges of early 20th century winter warfare: logistical fragility, the dominance of entrenched defenses over offensive tactics, and the devastating human cost of protracted battles fought in extreme conditions. Today, it stands as a case study in the difficulties of coalition warfare and the limits of massed manpower when unsupported by adequate planning and infrastructure, foreshadowing the broader unraveling of the Russian war effort in the years to follow.